The Lord be with you. A reading from the Holy Gospel according to Luke. The two disciples recounted what had taken place on the way and how Jesus was made known to them in the breaking of bread. While they were still speaking about this, he stood in their midst and said to them, "Peace be with you." But they were startled and terrified and thought that they were seeing a ghost. Then he said to them, "Why are you troubled? And why do questions arise in your hearts? Look at my hands and my feet, that it is I myself. Touch me and see, because a ghost does not have flesh and bones as you can see I have." And as he said this, he showed them his hands and his feet. While they were still incredulous for joy and were amazed, he asked them, "Have you anything here to eat?" They gave him a piece of baked fish. He took it and ate it in front of them. He said to them, "These are my words that I spoke to you while I was still with you, that everything written about me in the law of Moses and in the prophets and Psalms must be fulfilled." Then he opened their minds to understand the scriptures, and he said to them, "Thus it is written that the Christ would suffer and rise from the dead on the third day, and that repentance for the forgiveness of sins would be preached in his name to all the nations, beginning from Jerusalem. You are witnesses of these things." The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, Lord Jesus Christ.
There's a true story in the book Ripley's Believe It or Not about a judge in Yugoslavia who had an unfortunate accident. He was electrocuted when he reached up to turn on the light while standing in the bathtub. Not a good thing to do. His wife found his body sprawled on the bathroom floor. She called for help, screaming for friends and neighbors, police, anyone who'd come, and they all showed up. He was pronounced dead and taken to the local funeral home. The local radio picked up the story and broadcast it all over the air. Well, in the middle of the night, the judge regained consciousness. When he realized where he was, he rushed over to alert the night watchman, who promptly ran off terrified. The first thought of the judge was to phone his dear wife and reassure her. He did, but he got no further than saying, "Hello, darling, it's me," when she screamed and passed out. He tried calling a couple of the neighbors, but they all thought it was some sort of sick prank. He even went so far as to go to the house of several relatives, but they were all sure he was a ghost and slammed the door in his face. Poor judge. Finally, he was able to call a fellow judge from a neighboring town who was a good friend of his, and he phoned several of the friends and neighbors to convince them that indeed the judge was alive. Now, can you imagine that? Now, you pharaohs, that little angel of yours bursted my bubble again. Did you notice this little, how old is he now? He's 2 years old. When I announced grades kindergarten through second grade may be dismissed to go to the parish hall for the church, he's like, "I'm out of here." Before that priest starts talking. I'm hurt. A pharaoh devastated me. Oh. You watch and see his punishment. He'll become a Catholic priest someday. That'll get you. And that brings us to our gospel for today. We have another one of the appearance stories of Jesus after the resurrection. And once again, we hear from St. Luke. This is the third time Luke tells us that the Lord appeared on Easter. Now, what's interesting, if you listen to those details, you may be saying to yourself, you know what? Sounds a lot like the gospel we heard last Sunday from John chapter 20. And in fact, it is very similar to John 20 and actually in a detail to John chapter 21. But all the gospel writers have their unique details, so let's look at what Luke's trying to say to us. First of all, like Jesus in John 20, verses 19 and 21, if you remember when he appeared to the disciples, they had locked the doors of where they were for fear of the Jewish authorities and retaliation from them. Jesus came through the doors and he said, "Peace be with you." Notice what he does in Luke's gospel. He does the same exact thing. He says, "Peace be with you," to these disciples. Now, please note, Jesus is not flipping the peace sign for you children of the 60s like we did way back when. He is stating fact, and here's what I mean by that. The word for peace, eirene in Greek, translates the Hebrew shalom, which means pure and simple, everything is right now. What was wrong? Well, first of all, the sin of Adam, which caused the fall of the human race, and then that scandal on Calvary. The betrayal, the denial, the cowardice, all of that had been wiped away by virtue of Jesus' resurrection. And so when he says, "Peace be with you," he is not wishing them peace. He is stating fact. Everything has been wiped away. We are right with God now. You didn't know that, Peggy, did you? All right. Then we're told the disciples are terrified. Always that's the reaction when they first encountered Jesus, and there's a reason for that, which I'll explain momentarily. But then Jesus takes them to task, as he always does. "Why are you terrified?" he says. He says, "Look at my hands and my feet." And he shows them his hands and his feet. Now, you may say to yourself, that sounds different from last Sunday's gospel, and it should. In John 20:20, when Jesus enters the room in that scene, he shows the disciples his hands and his side. Why does Luke put feet along with hands? For a very simple detail. When you go back to John chapter 19, verse 34, at the crucifixion scene, only in John's account, after Jesus takes his last breath and gives over his spirit to the Father, only then does a Roman soldier come with a large lance and he pierces the side of Jesus. And we're told that blood and water flow from the side of Jesus. And so Luke does not have that detail in his account of the crucifixion. So why should he mention Jesus showing his hands and his side? In Luke's thinking, it's hands and feet. Then Jesus wants to convince the disciples that he's for real. And he says to them, "Do you have anything to eat?" And they give him a piece of baked fish. Now in John chapter 21, Jesus will be baking fish on the shore when he appears to his disciples. Now I remember one time teaching a course on John's Gospel a number of years ago, and a bright young man in the class raised his hand and said, "I know why Jesus is eating baked fish." And I said, "Well, tell me." And I thought, well, I've got me a young scholar in this class. And he said, "Because he's promoting a heart-friendly diet." To which I said, wrong. Dr. Linsenmeyer might want to hear that, but that's not what's going on here. Jesus is not promoting a heart-friendly diet. He's trying to demonstrate to these stubborn disciples that he's for real. A ghost can't eat, but Jesus can. What they're saying is not a figment of their imagination. It is truly and real Jesus Christ. And then he does something that he did in the other appearance story in Luke's Gospel, on the road to Emmaus. We're told he opens their minds to the meaning of the Scriptures, and boy, do they get a dose of the Scriptures. He talks to them about the first 5 books of the Hebrew Scriptures. Then he talks to them about the prophets and about the Psalms, all the while explaining to them the passages that refer to the fact that the Messiah had to suffer, had to die, in order to be raised for the salvation of his people. And once they hear those Scriptures, all of a sudden, they become believers. And then Jesus does something interesting. He tells them that they are to be his witnesses. Now what's interesting, only Luke will use that word witnessing to Jesus of the gospel writers. The word witness is a powerful, loaded word. Its root is a Greek word martyroi, which translates into English two ways. Number one, witness, to witness, but also to be martyred. Or in other words, what he's saying to these disciples is that if you get out there and you witness to me, it's going to cost you at some point. And we know for many of those disciples, it did. They would go on to lay their lives down for Jesus by witnessing to him. What's the point of this passage for us? Maybe the questions in our mind about being able to recognize the presence of Jesus. How do we do that? And people have asked me through the years. Well, first of all, the scriptures are a dead ringer. When you read the scriptures and you pray the scriptures and you take the scriptures to heart, I'm not talking about glossing over the holy book. When you truly immerse yourself in the scriptures, you experience the presence of the Lord. He is faithful to his word as he promised. But for we Catholics, what happens here at this altar is another way that we experience the risen Lord in this Eucharist. Here we say to the world, what is bread and wine changes, even though it looks and tastes the same, into the body and blood of Christ. He is transformed and becomes present to us in this Eucharist. That's why it's never appropriate to refer to it as the bread or the wine, because the Lord promised to be with his church to the end of time, and this is one way that he is truly and really present in his risen state. But there's another way, and that is through the people that we encounter in this life who witness to the presence of the Lord. And that could be anyone from your grandmother to your spouse to your teacher to whomever through the years that you have counted. And when you look at how they pray, when you look at how they live their lives, you know in your heart it's unquestionable that they have faith in the presence of Christ in his risen state. This past week, there was a news story released that didn't make it into the mainstream media, surprise, surprise, but it did hit the Catholic news services about a very special priest. Right now in our country, we're celebrating the 100th anniversary of the sinking of the Titanic. Not a real joyful thing to celebrate, but we are celebrating that. The movie was a powerful movie. But one thing you won't hear about in the media was the story about the Catholic priest chaplain who was assigned to the Titanic. His name was Father Thomas Biles. He had been an Anglican by faith. He converted to Catholicism, and so he was told by his brother Robert, who was living in New York, Father Thomas lived in England, that he was going to get married in New York, and would Father Thomas come and do his brother's wedding, to which he said yes. Now, please remember, transportation at that time across the water was not the easiest thing to get your hands on. And so when he saw that there was a call that went out for a Catholic priest to be chaplain of the Titanic on its maiden voyage, he signed up. He put his name in the hat, and they pulled it. And so that was his transportation to New York City, unfortunately. When the Titanic hit, and there were several eyewitness accounts, when the Titanic hit the iceberg, where was Father Biles? Not in his bunk sleeping. He was praying his breviary, his priestly prayer book, on the deck of the ship. It got knocked into the water, unfortunately. It was lost. But then he went into action. He began helping loading elderly and infirmed tourists into the lifeboats. 2 times, Father Biles turned down the opportunity to get into one of those lifeboats and to have his life spared, and he refused it both times. He would be there, and we're told that by eyewitnesses that there were people lined up for him to hear their confessions before they either got into a lifeboat or they would perish as the ship went down. And then, the very last thing that he was seen doing by an eyewitness who got into the last lifeboat was Father Biles standing on the deck of the ship, surrounded by a large crowd of Jews and Catholics on their knees as he led them in the rosary. That's how he went to his death in the icy waters, praying and helping others spiritually. What does that have to do with anything? Well, you could say, well, it was courage. It was heroism on his part, and absolutely it was courage and heroism. But why? Why did he choose to do it then? Why did he choose to pass up safety in order to give his life then? Because he knew the words of the Lord. In John 15, we find that powerful and piercing passage. Jesus says, there's no greater love than this, than to lay down one's life for one's friends. Father Biles knew that the Lord was alive. He knew that his master had gone on ahead of him 2,000 years earlier and laid down his life for his friends, so that when his friends would close their eyes for the last time, they would not see darkness, but rather light. Father Thomas had rock-solid faith in the resurrection. And so he was prepared to give his life for others so that they could experience the resurrection too. And for him, the way you do that is through your prayer and by receiving absolution before you take your last breath. That's why he courageously stayed aboard that ship and went down with her to the bottom of the sea. So my brothers and sisters, there are many Father Biles in this world. Hollywood doesn't necessarily tell us about many of them, but there are people whose faith is so strong in the resurrection of Jesus that they have gone on to sacrifice everything for the Lord and his people. And so let us pray today as we prepare to baptize little Caroline, that what we're doing for her will be renewed in us. May our faith be rock solid and strong, that Jesus is alive. He is risen from the dead. And may we live this day and every day as witnesses to this wonderful truth.